Welcome, everybody. Kylee and I are glad to host another episode of the Ask Evoke podcast. We've got some entertaining and interesting questions this month, excuse me. And we will be doing another one in December before the holidays. So if you've got questions, please shoot them our way. And just as a note on what we've been doing this past month, all of the coaches came together at our annual coach meeting, which we use for kind of educational purposes, and it's a good social time for us. We did this in Las Vegas a couple of weeks ago, and the reason for choosing Las Vegas is not so much the strip or the gambling, but we have ready access to Red Rocks Park. So we were able to spend some time out there climbing and running and hiking a bit, as well as got a lot of FaceTime with all the coaches, and we had some very spirited and great discussions. And I think it's one of the things that has built such a strong team for us.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, Kylee, thank you for joining me today, and we better dive in.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Scott. So I guess we'll just start right at it. We have a question here from Dave, and Dave did an anaerobic threshold test. Now, instead of 30 minutes, he chose a vertical kilometer. So he was out for 1 hour. And just for a little bit of background for us, his first 15 minutes, his average heart rate was 177 beats per minute. Second 15 minutes, 174 beats per minute. Third 15 minutes, his heart rate dropped a bit to 167. And fourth 15, it dropped a little more to 165. So he maintained a fairly high heart rate of average 171 for the hour test. So Dave's question is, first one, I find it hard to believe that I can really sustain an effort of 175 beats per minute for more than 30 minutes. How is this possible? I'm almost at my max heart rate. I thought this kind of effort is only doable for a very short amount of time.
Well, Dave, you have just proven that it is possible. You just did it. So you have to forget the idea that it's not possible. The only explanation I can see, and you don't mention what your maximum heart rate is or how you determined it, but my guess is your maximum heart rate is substantially higher than this, that you're not actually at your maximum heart rate, because that would be impossible. You can't hold a maximum heart rate for more than basically a minute, maybe, before you're going to blow a gasket. So don't worry about what your maximum heart rate is. You just defined what your anaerobic threshold is with this test. So I would just, maximum heart rate doesn't really matter to any of us. It doesn't come into, it's not a factor when we're deciding, how to adjust our training. So I would leave that completely aside. Don't worry about it. But this kind of a field test, this is one of the reasons we like these field anaerobic threshold tests. They give us some really good and solid data that's directly related to your performance. But I do think I think you're going to ask, it's one of your next questions maybe, but so then let's move on to that next question.
Sure. His next question was, after 30 minutes, I could clearly feel that the limiting factor were my legs and not my cardio, which you can also see in my lower average elevation gain, and my heart rate declined. If I do more muscular endurance training, will I be able to maintain 175 beats per minute for the rest of the climb? Or is the limiting factor my cardio?
Yeah, just so people can see this, he started off climbing at 965 meters per hour, but by the end, the average for the last 15 minutes was 759 meters per hour. So, basically over 200 meters per hour slowdown. So that's a pretty significant slowing. And you felt, Dave, that it was in your legs, which is, you have both your heart rate dropping, which indicates that it was your legs that were slowing you down, not the pumping capacity of your heart. And this is really common with endurance athletes. And, even though this was only a 1 hour event, it's a very taxing one because you're having to lift your body up 1,000 meters. And so when the legs begin to fatigue, and there are lots of mechanisms of fatigue that could be causing this, but basically the muscle fibers start checking out. And that's why you slow down. Your brain is no longer able to recruit the higher powered muscle fibers that would allow you to continue on at the faster speed you started at. And because your muscles aren't doing as much work, your heart doesn't have to supply as much blood. And so your heart rate begins to drop. And that's exactly, you saw your heart rate drop from an average of 177 in the first 15 minutes to an average of 165 in the last 15 minutes. So all of that would indicate that the limiting factor here is local muscular endurance. And it would probably improve whether you can actually maintain 175 for the whole climb. I don't know, but doing some strength type work like muscular endurance will definitely allow you to keep a higher heart rate for longer.
Yeah, Scott, I know when we talk about really highly trained athletes, we often talk about the spread between their aerobic and anaerobic as being less than 10%. Have you seen any correlation with the anaerobic and max heart rate? If you're really highly trained, your anaerobic threshold could be quite close to your max heart rate. Do you also see that as very close?
It is possible, but it's still, it's not something that, well, shouldn't say that. I guess I was about to say the wrong thing, but don't want to be too confusing here.
Yeah.
I had an Olympic athlete I was working with a number of years ago his aerobic threshold was very high. I think it was like this guy had a max heart rate of 185. His anaerobic threshold was 175, and his aerobic threshold was 165. So everything was jammed together up there near the top. But it's still, his anaerobic threshold was still about 10 beats below his maximum heart rate.
Okay.
So yes, you can have that kind of physiology if you're, trained really well. It's certainly possible, but most of us is so uncomfortable to get close to our maximum heart rate. That's the reason most max heart rate tests last only, 2 or 3 minutes at the max most. They don't go any longer than that because you can't sustain your max heart rate for longer than that.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's interesting for sure. He has one more question that I'll say about this. And he says, after the climb, I continued my run for another 10K and 200 meters of elevation. As soon as I had to run upwards again, my heart rate went straight up to 165, but I couldn't get it any higher even if I wanted to. I have the impression that my legs were the limiter if my analysis is right. But this is an interesting question because I've experienced this myself too, Scott. Like once you've exhausted that max heart rate or with an anaerobic threshold test, even if you rest a little bit, it's often hard to get that heart rate way back up there again. What is that, the muscular fatigue, or how would you explain that?
That's the best explanation I can imagine. I'm not a physiologist, but I don't hear this kind of subject talked about very often. I think we at Evoke have been kind of on the cutting edge of this whole notion that, local muscular fatigue is really what causes most people to slow down in endurance events. So I would say that this fits exactly with the model that we use that describes this phenomenon that your muscles you're too tired now. So yes, it shoots up quickly to 165, but you can't get any higher than that, even if you tried to push it. And that's, we see this, the most common place I've seen this has been in ultra runners, where I can see their heart rate trace for whether it's a 50 kilometer or a 50 mile or whatever, and I will see their heart rate dropping over the course of the race, even in the final climb often, where they're pushing as hard as they can, but their heart rate, maybe it's only getting up to, I've literally seen this with people who normally could hit 165 easily. They can't get over 135 at the end of a long race. And, you know, the only explanation that makes sense to me, I mean, your heart muscle, yeah, heart muscle does fatigue, but there's not like, you know, skeletal muscle. You know, skeletal muscle, we know fatigues, and it fatigues very, you know, relatively quickly. Whereas heart muscle is, you know, the most vascularized. It's the slowest of the slow twitch muscle fibers that we have. So, you know, and I've read a little bit about cardiovascular muscular fatigue. That's a neuromuscular problem. So there's, I guess there's some possibility that that's related, but we've noticed that when we improve an athlete's muscular endurance, they can maintain a higher heart rate for longer. So that, you know, we're kind of working off of evidence that we see when we train people and with their race results and whatnot, rather than, you know, something we read in a study.
Yeah, that neuromuscular fatigue component, that's is fascinating. And I wonder, I mean, when I've experienced this the most or seen it is actually on the high end of things, like towards sprinting or anaerobic work, whereas like a true maximal effort, once you throw that out there, those fast twitch muscles are quite tired and it is hard to replicate. So maybe there is an interplay as well, the neurological connections, especially on a 30-minute effort like his, which was, or an hour, which is a little bit shorter as well. I don't know.
I think that, no, I think you're hit on something. And I'll just mention something about fatigue mechanisms. I mean, there's a lot of things that will make us slow down. You know, probably one of the more common ones that's known is the accumulation of lactate and the hydrogen ions that go along with the lactate. And those hydrogen ions and the lactate are a product of glycolytic metabolism. In other words, the breakdown of sugars, which is what you need for high intensity activity. But when the pH of the muscle, and this is the, you know, acid base balance, is measured by pH. You might remember this from high school chemistry, but we can only operate within a very narrow range of pH levels before the alarm bells start going off in the body and things start to happen. And so when the acidity goes up, that drives the pH number down. When it gets outside of this kind of homeostasis range that it's designed to operate in, and it begins to shut down the glycolytic metabolism, which is the metabolism that's allowing you to go fast. So you begin to slow down. And you can prove this very easily to yourself, is go run up a hill as hard as you can for as long as you can. You will find out that you will slow down and you'll feel the burn in your legs. And, you know, I don't know, and I'm not sure anybody knows what that burn actually is. Maybe it is the change in the acidity in the muscles, but you know, no matter how strong-willed you are, you will be forced to slow down. And if you could continue, you know, and you had incredible willpower, you could continue to go until you would just literally fall over, because there would be no glycolytic metabolism that's able to support movement. So that's kind of a long-winded way of addressing this subject, but that's one of the more common for racers and people who are doing events, let's say less than, you know, 30, 45 minutes. That's a really common phenomenon to feel. When we get into the ultra distance, one of the main things that'll slow people down is the running out of glycogen. And we've all heard of you know, if you have never experienced bonking, it's worth trying it and feeling what it feels like to bonk really hard. But basically, when your body runs out of or runs really low on glycogen, the brain can only run on glycogen, or it can run on ketones too, but it's a more complicated process. But when we get low on glycogen, you'll get, you know, woozy headed, not clear thinking, you lose muscular coordination, and energy just drops through the floor because you're basically can only rely on fat metabolism at that point. So those are two really common fatigue mechanisms. And then we get down to kind of the one we've been talking about, which is this neuromuscular. And I don't know, again, not being a physiologist, I can't say for sure, but there's an interplay between, you know, the motor center of the brain and the muscles, and you have these motor units. And for whatever reason, and I don't know whether it's caused in the muscle cell itself or something that happens upstream of that, either in the brain or in the motor unit or motor nerve, that basically when you get to this point of fatigue, the brain just goes, nope, done, not going to recruit those muscle fibers anymore. And then of course the result is you slow down, because it's the faster twitch fibers that fatigue the first. So they're the first ones that will basically cry uncle and quit.
Yeah.
And then you're forced to slow down. So when I speak in terms of the neuromuscular fatigue component, I'm not really trying to differentiate whether that fatigue is the result of something that's actually going on in the muscle cell or something that's in the nervous system. But we know that it happens, and there's been a lot of anecdotal evidence from studies at long races that show that neuromuscular fatigue is the dominant fatigue in these especially in ultra running races.
Yeah. No, that's good. All right, let's move on to our next question here. It's a bit of an unusual one from Edwin, and he says, back in the day when I was racing bikes, one of the local crushers told me about one of his interval workouts. As I recall, it was something like 10 sprint efforts of 20 seconds each. But at 10 seconds, he would start holding his breath until the interval was over. It's been 10 years since I was told about this, so the numbers could be a little off. The theory, I guess, was that when you are sprinting in a bike race, you have likely spent an hour or so at high exertion, and so holding your breath simulated that somehow. Do you think this breath holding technique was doing any good, or was his success in spite of using that? And my second question is, if it has any validity for bike racing, do you think it is transferable to mountain sports? Obviously, it is much more rare to have a sprint as hard as you can in a mountain sport. But for example, with an ultra, sometimes I wished I was more efficient at using the little oxygen available for myself when running or boot packing above 14,000 feet. Those are his questions. Breath holding.
Breath holding, yeah. Well, the sprint is going to be, especially something as short as 20 seconds, is going to rely on two main energy pathways. Well, actually three. The first one would be the stored ATP and creatine phosphate that's in the muscle fiber. That's going to be the first thing that goes. And that usually, well, maybe not after an hour plus of riding fairly hard, unless you're well trained, that you may not be able to keep those stores at a high level. But if you were well trained, and I think this is how, when we watch the Tour de France sprints at the end of some of those stages, you can see the power those guys are developing is incredible. And that's because they do have the capability of maintaining those high levels of ATP and creatine phosphate stores. But those are only going to last for 10 seconds. And then we also have the anaerobic glycolytic pathway that will be kicking in during that 10 seconds. But neither one of those requires oxygen. And because they're both anaerobic processes. So I don't think there would be any benefit. I mean, other than I'm sure he was suffering. I mean, it sounds hard. So maybe he was just training himself to be tougher by doing this. But I can't see where, from a physiological standpoint, that would really be beneficial. And also we have a store of oxygen in the muscle cell in what's called the myoglobin. And that's also enough for a few seconds, so maybe up to 8 to 10 seconds worth of aerobic work. So there's some stored oxygen in there too. So I have a feeling that his success came from the other parts of his training. And again, maybe this sounds brutal, actually. That, and holding your breath for 10 seconds isn't that hard. So I just have a hard time thinking that was the key to some kind of success. And I don't think it would have any benefit for, long duration, low intensity work like boot packing at 14,000 feet. There, acclimatization to the altitude is going to be the biggest factor in your performance. Like, how well acclimated are you to those high elevations?
Yeah, this question made me think of those silly infomercials that you see sometimes where there's like ab machines that jiggle your abs for you that are core. It kind of seems like a simulating of the feeling of being out of breath, but you're not actually training, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you're training something. I mean, you train to
Mhm.
sprint at maximum intensity, it's
Yeah,
using a lot of muscle, developing muscle power and all that. But I don't think it would have any kind of a positive endurance training effect.
for sure. Okay, the next question we have, Scott, is about altitude. And this person says, I'm preparing for a 50-kilometer race at altitude, and the race takes place between 1,500 and 2,800 meters, but I live at 500 meters. I can train at race altitude once a week, occasionally twice. For context, I typically train 5 to 6 days per week with a weekly long run, a hill session, and interval work. I'm able to include a good amount of elevation gain in my runs, even at 500 meters where I live. My main concern is ensuring I can handle the altitude during the race. My question is training at race altitude just once a week enough to have any meaningful effect on acclimatization or performance, or is it too infrequent to make a difference? That's his first question.
Okay, first question. Normally I would say it's going to have a minimal effect, but this acclimatization is very poorly understood what the processes are. And some people are, rapid responders to, exposure to high altitude, and other people are actually literally non-responders. There's people who just won't acclimatize no matter how long they stay. So we don't know where you fit along that scale, or that range, but I would say that it's going to be better than nothing. But I normally would say, let's say that's maybe you're up there for 2 hours a week or 2 or 3 hours a week. I don't think that's going to move the needle very much in the acclimatization process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Scott, like so if he lives at 500 and he goes up to 3,000 or 2,800 meters once per week, what physiologically is going to be happening to him when he trains once a week there? I'm assuming that the any adaptations would within a week get lost. Is that kind of what you're saying? Or
Well, that's something again that is just poorly understood. And I've told this little story before, but I think it's worth repeating. So about 10 years ago, I was a speaker at a NATO Special Operations Winter Warfare Conference. And one of the speakers, who I was just enthralled by, was this guy, Dr. Robert Roach, who is a physiologist at the University of Colorado Medical Center. And he's done a tremendous amount of research on acclimatization and how it affects us. He performed an experiment that I thought I'll make it brief here, but basically he took a bunch of cross-country runners from the University of Oregon, and they went to either Bolivia or Ecuador, and they lived at an observatory where there was a dormitory for them all. They lived there, and I think it was at around 5,000 meters roughly. And they were there for 2 weeks, and he took an entire genetics lab with him down there to analyze what was going on. And he kept the test was only 2 weeks long for a reason, and that was, let's see what happens before your body's had a chance to start making new red blood cells. Because in those first 2 weeks, your hematocrit or your red blood cell count won't really change at all, but something is happening, and they wanted to know what. So they did a time trial on day number 1, which you can imagine how that felt at that altitude coming from Oregon at sea level. And then at the end, they did another time trial with just these people living at that altitude. And their average improvement in time was 25%. So there was a significant improvement in performance and obviously acclimatization without any change in the red blood cell count. So he looked at the genes, and he found that over about a half of the human genome was affected, and about one half of that, or one quarter overall, was upregulated. The genes were kind of more highly turned on, and about half of them were deregulated or downregulated. And but he only knew what, maybe a handful, 3 or 4 of these genes even did. And so there's a huge genetic component to acclimatization. So that's a long-winded way of answering this. But so exposing yourself like this person is doing occasionally for even just a few hours, it's going to have some kind of an effect. Probably not going to change his red blood cell count, but it may be triggering certain genetic adaptations. But how much, we don't know. It's highly independent. Like, for instance, the most active genes in this experiment were genes that are most prevalent in Ethiopian and Kenyan runners who live at high altitude, and Sherpas, and not Bolivian, I think Peruvian Indians. They all share this trait of having this one particular gene that's super active in them, that must have something to do with acclimatization. But again, if he doesn't know, I sure don't know.
Yeah, it would be really fascinating to be able to test all of these elite athletes and see if all the ones who do very well at altitude all have that. You would think they would have that gene as well, but it would be fascinating, hey, like the Killian and the David Goetler. Yeah,
and actually I've written an article about this. It's on the website. It's called Epigenetics of Acclimatization. So people that are interested in that can go read that article. But I think epigenetics is basically changes in your genes due to your environment. And Killian turned me on to this, and we were discussing it once, which is what caused me. And then he sent me a bunch of information, which I kind of compiled into that article. But I think one of the reasons he does so well at altitude is that he grew up there. He's been years and years, and so there's been some studies showing that people who are born at altitude, even if they go live at sea level for a long time, they come back to altitude, they acclimatize very quickly. So there is something to do with our environment that can affect the genes too.
Yeah, it's super interesting. This guy who asked the question, his name's Ben. His second question, which I think we could just answer very briefly, he said, how significant is the difference between my approach and moving to race altitude for, say, 3 to 4 weeks before the event? And I think
I think I've answered that. Yes, you're going to be far better off.
Probably better off moving 3 to 4.
You're better if you have the capability of going there a month before the race. That's going to make a much bigger difference, and you're going to have the opportunity to train on the course, which I think should not be underestimated.
Yeah, if you're more interested in that, I did a podcast with Dr. Reed about his hard rock preparation, and he lives not nearly as high as hard rock, and he went through what he did. He went there 4 or 5 weeks ahead of the race, and it was quite an involved acclimatization, but it worked very well. So I think, unfortunately, there's not a shortcut for altitude, which would be nice.
No, unfortunately, no magic pill yet.
Yes. Okay, the next question is on aerobic base training. And this is a question that we get a lot, but there's a little more to it. So this person says, what is the minimum effective dose for aerobic base training? For example, I have a couple of options where I could add volume. So this person is asking if it's better to run 30 minutes every day, once a week, or they could walk carrying a pack for 60 minutes. And this is for their zone 2 training. Is there a benefit between the modality, or is it just duration? That was kind of the gist of their question.
Yeah, well, that's a great question about what's the minimum dose, and that's going to be very individual. If you take an elite world-class athlete, one of these mountain runners that's winning big races, the minimum effective dose for them could easily be 100 miles a week, because if they don't get that, they're going to begin to detrain. So it depends a great deal on, if you're just beginning this, getting out. I mean, I don't think this person is in this category because he's training for Orizaba, I think, and maybe some Mount Baker, Rainier. Yeah.
So they're doing our 24-week training plan. So I think they're a
So
little bit, yeah.
But regardless, if you were just taking the other end of the spectrum from the elite endurance athlete, looking at an absolute beginner, for them, an hour a week of aerobic work would be a good stimulus for somebody who's coming off the couch. So this person is somewhere in between, an hour and a week and 100 miles a week. What that would be, I can't say based on their fitness. It's too much based on their fitness, their age, genetics, that sort of thing. And so, I wish there was an easy way to tell you that. The only way I can tell you if the training is working is you can do an aerobic threshold test, or what we might even call an aerobic threshold time trial. Just go walk as fast as threshold pace, and then train as you are training for several weeks, and then go back and repeat that same test. And if you're faster, then the training at the same heart rate, then the training's working. And if you're not, then you might maybe you have reached the minimum effective dose and you need now to go beyond it in order or I should say, you're not reaching the minimum effective dose for this new fitness level. It was a fine minimum effective dose, a few months ago when you first started, but now you're going to have to raise the bar and increase the volume somewhat.
Scott, I think too, he's asking if for time effectiveness between running 30 minutes each day or walking 45 minutes and adding a pack so the intensity is more like the 30-minute run. Interesting question, because they're working a little bit different system or goals.
Exactly. Yeah. And if he's following our 24-week training plan, you'll notice that there is weighted pack carries, but they come much later in the program. And we don't recommend people start with weighted training early. And if you don't have a great aerobic base, the whole purpose of the first half of that training plan is to help you develop your aerobic system so that when you do add the weight, it's not, you're training another layer on top of the aerobic system, this muscular endurance component. And I would say that if you have the opportunity, running for 30 or walking for 45 or 60, if you're getting your heart rate into that same zone, then I don't think it matters really. I would say that when you're doing your weighted hiking, it should be up and downhill, not flat in your neighborhood. So I would try to make those workouts as specific. We generally recommend that as you read through that training plan, you'll see that we recommend using hilly terrain or gym machineries like a stair machine or a steep treadmill to simulate the vertical, because walking on the flat ground, even with a backpack on, is very different than going uphill in terms of the muscle recruitment strategy that your brain is using.
Yeah. And then secondary to this, he is asking, is there a merit in doing any focused work on raising VO2 max correlated with performance at altitude? And then he said he had a gas exchange test done and my score was 50. Would doing work to specifically increase it be beneficial? Or should the potential net increase I might realize from VO2 work come at the expense of my base training or something?
I would say we don't almost ever for mountaineers recommend high intensity interval style training, like what people often term VO2 max training. The reason for that is twofold. One is it's going to dramatically cut into your training volume because those workouts are quite fatiguing. And so you may have to reduce your overall training volume. And you will never reach that intensity when you're at altitude. There's an article where on the website about, I think it's these world-class alpinists. I think it's something like these alpinists put our methods to the test. And it was me collecting heart rate data from Uli Steck and David Gotler when they were on a expedition actually they were acclimatizing for a climb on Shishapangma. and they did this kind of training camp. And so I had the access to their heart rate data. And in it, I show, in that article, I show that even when they set the fastest known time on this peak called Island Peak, so they were going as fast as they could on that thing, their heart rate never got out of the 120, 125 range. So these are young, very fit guys, and they can't hit more than 125. There just isn't enough oxygen to support high intensity exercise. So that's why we focus so strongly on improving. We want you to be able to go really fast at low intensity rather than be going really fast at high intensity, because you can't use the high intensity up there.
Yeah. Yeah, my understanding of altitude, but you can, this is a question for you too, Scott, is that the higher the VO2 max you have, it doesn't correlate with being better at altitude. In fact, I had an Olympian speed skater friend who had to get helicoptered from base camp before. It doesn't universally apply. It's more the other things you were talking about in our previous question? Or has
Yes,
there been
I think that,
studies on this done?
well, there have been, I think, but I would say that you're right. That's my anecdotal experience is that like for instance, I know a study was done once on, and probably been more than one, on Sherpas, and found that their VO2 max tended to be in the 30s.
Oh,
So
wow.
like in this, like this guy right here has just said he's got a VO2 max of 50. Well, these are some of the best performers at altitude in the world, and they have a significantly lower VO2 max than even this 53-year-old amateur. So I think that's a pretty good indication that your performance at altitude is not determined by VO2 max.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Okay, our next question, Scott, is this gentleman says, I'm an ex-100-meter sprinter, so naturally have fast twitch fibers and tend to build muscle really easily. How can I strength train so that I get stronger but don't put on too much muscle mass? I'm 95 kilos. I'm thinking heavy lifts in the 2 to 5 rep range, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I love your podcast. Thanks for everything you do.
Yes, I think you've nailed it there. You would need to do heavy lifts in the very low rep range, probably multiple sets like that. Basically descending sets. So you might start with 5 reps at 75% of your 1 rep max, and then work down after 4 or 5 sets down to two or 1 rep at 90% of your 1 rep max. And that's a great way to stimulate your brain to recruit more muscle fiber. It's called max strength training. It doesn't have any hypertrophy effect. You will not gain muscle mass. I've used this for years with mountain athletes. And I think it works quite well. So that's what I would recommend.
Scott, have you had any athletes complain or be happy that they have a hypertrophy effect for muscular endurance? I don't find it has that effect with my athletes very much, but I'm just curious because it's super high rep, but theoretically it's below you shouldn't be maxing out on each set. Have you found people put on mass with that?
I haven't. No, I don't see that. Yeah, in people is that they gain muscle mass. I think what it is that you're not going to failure in each set, that's normally required, or it's one of the things that people that are doing hypertrophy training are looking for, is that each set takes them to failure. And so they're just trying to exhaust those muscle fibers over and over and over again. And we're not going all the way to failure. So yeah, I think
that could be
probably
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay, our next question is on overtraining. And this person, Phil, says, do you have any experience with sympathetic versus parasympathetic dominance in overtraining? I understand that most overtraining presents as increased sympathetic tone, but is it true that advanced overtraining can swing back to parasympathetic tone due to exhaustion of sympathetic resources?
Yeah. Yes.
And
Answer is yes.
yeah. Scott, do you want
There's
to just review for people the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic?
Sure. But I have a great podcast with Phil Maffetone on the overtraining subject. And there's also an article on the website and chapters in both books about this. But anyway, our nervous system, or the autonomic nervous system, this is the nervous system that basically runs our body, that with no input from us. It's, it's what makes you breathe. It's what makes you digest. It's what makes your heart rate go up or down. There's probably a myriad of other things that are controlled by the autonomic nervous system, but these are outside your normal control, as compared to, let's say, the motor nervous system, which is what we use to flex muscles. Anyway, the sympathetic side of the autonomic nervous system is often called the fight or flight system. That's the saber-toothed tiger jumps out from behind a tree. Your sympathetic nervous system is going to take over and you're going to sprint away to safety. The parasympathetic nervous system is often called the rest and digest system. It's the one that's responsible for kind of down regulating everything. It's what becomes more active when you're getting ready to go to sleep at night. And it's used for just kind of toning things down in your body. So you can think of sympathetic nervous system as kind of a up-regulating nervous system, and the parasympathetic as down-regulating the overall tone. And as this person points out, early stages of overtraining, and in many cases, this is as far as it ever goes, people will see an increased sympathetic, what they call tone or nervous system dominance, and that will usually the most common and easily recognized symptom of that is an increased resting heart rate. Now, with heart rate variability apps out there all over the place, you would also see a decrease in heart rate variability during the period with sympathetic overtraining. So then, however, in a really advanced case of overtraining, you will see the parasympathetic become dominant. And then what you'll actually see is a drop in the resting heart rate. And in both cases, fatigue is going to be pretty bad. You're going to notice you don't have much energy to perform. But in the parasympathetic case, it's really noticeable. You can it's hard to even climb a set of stairs sometimes with that kind of parasympathetic overtraining. And the only remedy is rest. There's really no other remedy that I know of, is to just, once you discover that you're in this overtrained state, which is one of the reasons I've written so much about it, is that I want to try to help people recognize it. And then once they recognize it, how to deal with it.
Yeah. Yeah, just not to get personal on you, Scott, but I know you've dealt with overtraining. Did you have sympathetic and parasympathetic, or did you catch it mostly?
No, by the time I realized what would happen, I was full on into the parasympathetic.
Oh, no. Okay.
Yeah, and it was pretty bad. I mean, I was in the midst of a ski racing career, and I literally could hardly climb a set of stairs.
Oh, wow.
I'd get lightheaded. I'd lose, I'd be breathing really hard. My legs would feel just terrible. And I ended up taking several months off. And then luckily I was able to bounce back from that. There are people who will, if you sustain a parasympathetic overtraining state for long enough, I've read about and interviewed, and some of those people wrote articles for us in the book, that they never recover. It's over. Like your athletic career is done, which is why I think it's so important and to understand overtraining and to be ultra cautious that you don't get overtrained, because there's just too much risk.
No, that's great. That's really interesting for sure. And like you said, you did a podcast with Phil if people want to have more info. Is that on the Vocast, Scott?
Yep, it is. Yeah. I don't remember the number, but people could scroll through and find it. It was relatively early on. I've been in the first 20 podcasts, I'm sure.
Good. The next question is, what are your thoughts on the Lumen metabolism tracker? It's a personal device that uses the respiratory exchange ratio to determine percentage of fat versus carbs being burned. That Phil says he's heard you talk about it in the past. What are your thoughts on that kind of metric?
As far as I don't remember specifically the Lumen, but I have seen other gas exchange metabolic trackers, but they are designed for determining your resting metabolic rate. They don't accommodate high rate of ventilation. So you wouldn't be able to, I mean, you could do this at very low intensities. I think they're, like I said, they're mainly designed for people who are trying to lose weight and would like to burn more fat. So they test you at your kind of the basal metabolic rate or resting metabolic rate. And as your breathing rate increases, ventilation increases, you won't be able to, they won't react fast enough. So that's the reason for doing a gas exchange test with a real Met cart in a lab, unless something has changed with Lumen. Maybe there are a number of devices out there. There's portable Met carts now that they still, I think the cheapest one I've seen, I've forgotten what it's called. It's around $500. But typically there's several thousand up to, 20,000 and more for professional grade. And there's a reason they're that expensive. So I don't think that a little resting metabolic rate would be useful for an athlete.
Because it's kind of in vogue, with the triathletes on watching their little YouTubes and stuff. They do, of course, lactic testing, but these portable metabolic cart machines as well. Their coaches are testing. What metric are they looking for? What are they trying to isolate?
Well, they're measuring. In all cases, you're measuring what's called the respiratory exchange ratio. And that's the ratio of inspired oxygen to expired CO2, because they can use a process called indirect calorimetry at that point. And the indirect calorimetry tells them how many calories you're burning per minute or hour, but also what the percentage of fat versus carbohydrate is that's being used. And so in all cases, whether you go to a lab that's testing, measuring with a $100,000 machine, or you use this Lumen, which I'm guessing is relatively cheap, it's measuring the RER. And from the RER, you can infer this other information about fat versus carbohydrate. In calories per hour, things like that.
And then are they using that to offset refueling consumption, or how is, data is interesting, but how is that data useful for the training?
Well, for two ways. One is it can be a very effective way of helping determine intensity zones for an athlete. When the RER is 0.7, then you're burning 100% fat. When the RER is 1, you're burning 100% carbohydrate. And in the middle there, at RER of 0.85, you're burning 50% carbs and 50% fat. And this is often called the crossover point, where the fat percentage is dropping and the carbohydrate percentage is increasing, and where they cross is known as the crossover point. And you can move the crossover point left or right on this scale by the type of training you do, the type of diet you do. We typically see when people are highly aerobically adapted, the crossover point will have moved to the right quite a ways. I mean, I've actually had athletes who had the crossover point at about 85% of their VO2 max. So they're still very aerobic. They're still relying on 50% fat at an intensity that's pretty darn close to VO2 max, within 15% of that. So that's one of the pieces of information that can come out from this. And then from that, it can be helpful in determining intensity zones.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just looking, one of my clients just did a VO2 max test, and I was looking at their data this morning, and of course it has that metric. I was just always fascinated why, like, I understand why lactate is used real time in the field, but I had never thought that that metabolic cart real time in the field would have been as useful, but it sounds like there's some interesting applications as well. Yeah.
I think so. And I think
Yeah.
for me, I still rely heavily on lactate testing for high level athletes.
For sure.
It doesn't tell us the exact ratio of fat to carbs, and you can have high lactate and high carbohydrate use. Excuse me, you can have
Mhm.
low lactates and a high carbohydrate use if you have a big enough aerobic engine. But it does give us a sense of the intensity. And that's really, I mean, it's like a snapshot into the metabolism of the muscle at that moment when you're taking the sample.
Yeah.
And it's a lactate meter is pretty fail-proof
Mhm.
to use, and they're relatively cheap and portable. I have
Yeah.
athletes that will go training with them. They carry it in a little fanny pack pouch, and yeah, run with it and then test themselves in the middle of a workout.
Yeah, for sure. Like I follow like Johannes Kleibo on Instagram, and he uses, it looks like every day pretty much. His grandpa's out there with the lactate. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I think it's a really valuable tool. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, our next question is from a runner, and they say, I ran my first ever race at 25K with 4,900 feet of elevation gain. I was in zone 4 or higher for 95% of this race. I spent 65% of my race time in zone 6 and a further 18% in zone 5. Any caveats? He's using the chorus heart rate zones, so they have 6 zones. My
Well,
max heart rate is 204, he says, and he's asking, is this dangerous? Was I pushing my heart rate too much or too far?
no, I mean, you lived through the race, so I don't think you did any
Yeah.
damage to yourself. However, I am dubious of any brand watch when they assign your zone system. One of the reasons we advocate very strongly for determining these two critical metabolic breakpoints in your for each individual with the tests, and then there's extensive documentation about this on the website, how to assess both what we call the aerobic threshold and the anaerobic threshold. And once you have the aerobic and anaerobic threshold design, which is basically your metabolic response to exercise intensity, once you have those 2 points defined and determined, then the whole zone system falls into place around those. Those are like anchors that you build your zone system off of. And as a consequence, they're going to be quite accurate. But we use a much simpler system that's just 4 heart rate zones. And again, it's all explained in that article. I won't go into great detail. But most of these watch companies, they're just taking your age and calling you, saying that your zone 1 is this and zone 2 is that, and that they're just using a percentage of some formula. There's no way that just there's no way you spent 65% of your time in zone 6, that you're in zone 4 for 95, but you can't be that. That intensity level cannot be sustained for, I would assume this race took you at least a couple of hours. I mean, you would be superhuman. I mean, even the world's best athletes can't maintain that high of an intensity for that long of a race. So, and then in fact, you hit 204, it's possible if you were very well rested that you hit your maximum heart rate in this race. However, I would say that, I mean, I'd like to know how you determine your max heart rate, because my hunch is it's not 204, but it's actually higher than 204. So I would do the test, build yourself your own zone system. You can manually adjust the Koros zone system to fit these real metabolic numbers that you're going to get out of these tests. And if you want to use 6 zones, feel free. I don't understand why people think they can or need to. trying to control your heart rate within, 4 or 5 beats. When you start slicing the intensity zone system into more or smaller and smaller bits, you can understand, like anybody who goes for a run, especially on hilly terrain, knows that it's really hard to keep your heart rate within plus or minus 10 beats of a number, let alone plus or minus 3 or 4 beats of that number. So I think it's kind of false precision to use. And I've seen up to 9 zone systems, believe it or not, which I think is ludicrous.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great clarity, Scott. As a coach, I think weekly I get a question almost about converting heart rate zones to Garmin or Sunto, or and you nailed it with the zones itself. It's just terminology. It's about understanding where your aerobic and anaerobic thresholds are, and then applying it to a zone system properly for yourself. People get very hung up on the, I guess, the fences of each different brand's zoning system.
Yeah, and it is really arbitrary, and but it's so easy to determine these 2 really critical metabolic points in your own physiology. I mean, it doesn't cost anything. It takes, very little time, a couple of hours in a week, and you can do it. And I think that's what I always recommend people do, and just just set up your zones manually.
Good. Our next question is timely with winter here, I guess. This person says, my primary sport is technical 100-mile ultra running, which I do relatively well, but I want to mix in some other sports in the winter. If I were to replace many or even most of my runs with cross-country skiing and cycling or some other sport, which run workouts should I keep? For example, do I maintain my speed and power run workouts, but switch my zone 1, 2 to skiing and cycling? If an cross-country ski day inevitably turns into a hard workout day, do I mix what I replace? So I guess they're trying to figure out how, and lots of our athletes are like this because they want to take advantage of the winter, and as you should.
Sure. I think cross-country skiing and cycling too, although if you can cycle outdoors, you can also probably run outdoors. And running is going to be more effective for you perhaps than cycling with your goal of 100-mile races. But yeah, I think cross-training in the wintertime is a really smart thing to do for most people to avoid injury and just the staleness that comes from too much running. And so I think there's some benefit. I would say you would, I would tend to push towards having your intensity days be as specific to the sport you're training for as possible. So I think your intensity days should be done running. And then your long days, and the nice thing about doing long zone 1 and 2 skiing or cycling is it doesn't beat you up like it does to do a long running workout, even at low intensity. So you're gonna be able to handle a higher volume of when you're mixing in cross-country skiing and cycling.
Yeah, we see this a lot with skimo too. People run in the summer and went to skimo in the winter. The only thing I'd add to what you said, Scott, is if you do want to ski and not run as much, make sure you plan like a month or 2 transition period back into your running so that you ease up your mileage, because although you're making yourself an aerobic machine with cross-country skiing, you're not using the same high impact load bearing muscles that you need to recondition.
Absolutely. Yeah. You can't just go straight out of a cross-country ski season and jump right into a full-on running program because your legs won't be able to handle that.
Yeah. So our next question, this person says, a question that I had is that it's been mentioned quite a few times that training above zone 2 can be detrimental to your overall aerobic capacity and can lead to aerobic deficiency syndrome. I find it difficult to resist the temptation to train at a higher intensity and would benefit from a scientific explanation why training above zone 2 causes this problem. This would help me rationalize spending less time there or being more strategic about my time above zone 2. Thank you.
Well, let's see if I can think of a good scientific way of explaining it. But once you get above the aerobic threshold, you are going to be, by definition, you're going to start using more carbohydrate than fat for fuel. And as a consequence, this is going to stimulate what they call the glycolytic metabolism. And it also is going to be producing blood lactate in the blood, which, as we just talked about a few minutes ago, that lactate molecule comes along with a hydrogen ion, which causes the acidity of the blood to change. Now, where this becomes a real problem, a big problem, is for people that train well above the aerobic threshold, is that will definitely cause you aerobic deficiency syndrome, because the oxidative path in the mitochondria gets downregulated. It goes, oh, I guess I'm not really needed. The aerobic system can kind of shut itself down a little bit. And then you will end up with ADS, aerobic deficiency syndrome. Now, stepping over it a little bit is not a big deal. I'd like to suggest, depends on how, if you have aerobic deficiency syndrome, the fastest way to fix it is to train in zone 2. Now, once you have fixed it, and by fixing it, we mean have elevated your aerobic threshold to within 10% of the anaerobic threshold. Once you've done that, then it's really positive. You do need to add high intensity training in there. And that helps because at that point, you need to be starting to train another system. But training the anaerobic system will downregulate the aerobic system, as the kind of the easiest way I could think to explain it, what's going on, and especially at really high intensities. So for this person, I would say keep your zone 2 runs in zone 2, except for maybe, I don't know, 10% of the training volume could be higher than that without having any significant slowing effect on improving aerobic capacity. One of the things that I like to able to run faster is we'll include strides or pickups into their easy runs. So you'd be doing zone 2, but then you'd accelerate the pace, not to a full sprint by any means, but just a fast, fun pace for 10, 12, 15 seconds maybe, and then slow down back to your easy pace again. And it does two things. One is it helps keep those faster twitch muscle fibers active and engaged, and it builds some strength in those. And it also makes you feel like, I can run fast. I haven't forgotten how to run fast.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good. I think a lot of people, that's a good explanation, because as he says, that some people like the feeling of the little bit harder exercise. So
sure, it feels like you're training. That's one of the reasons. That's one of the reasons that zone 3 gets overused so much, is that it actually you're training when you're in zone 3. Whereas if you're really aerobically deficient, zone 2 can feel so ridiculously easy and slow. You're having a hard time believing or understanding, how can this possibly be beneficial to me? But what it is a reflection of is that's all the power that your little aerobic system is capable of producing at this time. And what we're trying to do in this methodology, anybody who preaches the zone 2 type of training, you're trying to increase your aerobic capacity so you can run faster in zone 2. And eventually zone 2 will not be slow and will not be easy anymore. But it takes a while to get there. Yeah,
that's good. All right, the next question is from Josh from Colorado, and he says, my main sports are mountaineering and mountain hunting, and your training knowledge and plans have been incredibly effective for my performance and success in the mountains. My question is, how beneficial would it be to alternate shorter 6-week max strength and muscular endurance blocks throughout the year versus long 8 to 12 weeks blocks? These would involve a 5-week build, with week 6 being a down week. My curiosity about shorter blocks is born out of boredom than anything. Thanks again.
That's a good question. I mean, I think it would be beneficial. I don't know. I don't know that you'd need to keep a max strength program for 12 weeks. I have had people do muscular endurance training blocks that lasted 12 weeks to very good effect. But I would it sounds like you have a bunch of experience working with these longer 8 to 12 week blocks. I would suggest try it and see how it affects you. I don't have a real definitive answer, but yeah, try this 5 week build with the 6th week being a recovery week, and do a couple of those and see if that isn't beneficial.
For sure. Our next question is someone, and they said that they want to ruck a marathon for an event in March. Is it possible to continue running ultras and still build fitness for rucking and not notably impact the ultra running? So maybe it's a charity, or I'm not sure why they are doing that, but
yeah. Yeah. So, well, one of the things that we frown on and try to discourage people from doing is running with a ruck. Running with a weight on your back is a recipe. It's a beeline directly towards overtraining or injury. So, or mainly injury, I should have said. So I would limit the amount of running you did with a pack to only a very little bit, because I'm assuming you want to run this marathon with a pack on your back. If that's not the case and you're going to be walking it, then that's fine. You can add more rucking into your training plan. And I don't think it'll noticeably impact your running too negatively. I mean, it will be if you get above probably 20 or 30% of your total volume, if you start cutting out the running, because running and walking have different mechanics, different muscle recruitment strategies. So I wouldn't go all in on the rucking part at the expense of running.
Okay, our next question is, can you get fast by only doing low intensity work? And I know fast is relative, but I'm talking about 6 minute, 30-second, or 7 minutes per mile.
Absolutely. We see it all the time. And you won't maximize your potential for running fast doing this. But if you are, let's say you're currently only able to run a 9 or 10 minute per mile in zone 2, it's not at all far-fetched. We see it all the time. People will drop 20, 30% off of their pace at aerobic threshold with just zone 2 training. And if you go and look in our military section of the website, you'll see where I've given a bunch of examples in one, I've forgotten which article right now, but it wouldn't take long for you to find it, about how this training works. Because we often see in the military guys coming to us who need to be able to run at these kind of speeds, 6.5, 7 minute mile, and they can't. But we put them into zone 2 work, and maybe they come to us and they can only run a 12-minute mile. And you'll see in these examples I put, we have just within a few months of nothing but low intensity work, drop their pace back down into this kind of a range. So yes, it's entirely possible to learn to be able to run faster. Another thing to keep in mind is that a world-class long distance runner will be able to run at a 5-minute mile pace in zone 2. So yes, you can get really, really fast in zone 2. Now it does, when you get down into this range, 6:37 minute mile pace, then you're probably going to be needing to start introducing some faster running, some higher intensity. But first you need to get down to close to this level. And you can do that with nothing but aerobic stimulus.
Good. We're nearing the end here, Scott. We have our last question. And they said, I completed the Pacific Crest Trail 2 years ago. By the time I finished, I was comfortably hiking 30+ mile days, 6 days a week. Can I get back to this level of fitness without spending 5 months hiking every day? I live in Washington, so I have access to mountains, but I work 12-hour shifts, I believe, and I find it hard to fit in a ton of aerobic work lifting, climbing, and social activities without feeling completely run down.
Yeah, and you don't want to get completely run down. You're not doing yourself any good at all that way. Would you be able to get back to that same level? Probably not, because that's an extreme, 5 months of 6 days a week of 30 miles a day. That's a pretty extreme exercise regimen that you were doing. And can you do that on, 2 or 3 hours a week? No, you won't be able to get back to that. There is no shortcut. I mean, the reason you could do so much 6 days a week, 30 miles a day, is that you did spend 5 months building up to that. And unfortunately, once you stop using it, your body goes, oh, I guess I don't need all these adaptations that I've made in order to help you go 30 miles every day. And I'll just start losing those adaptations. Now, some of them stick around longer than others, but in general, there's no shortcut to that level of fitness. If there's this, you could take this same example with, let's say, a world-class marathon runner who really the minimum effective dose for that person is going to be something in the range of 100 miles of running per week. And so can they maintain that level of fitness by if they cut it to 50 miles a week? No. The body will go, oh, I guess I don't need to be that fit anymore. So I'm going to just get rid of all these extra adaptations that I've been making to support 100 miles a week, because now you're telling me you only need to be able to go 50 miles a week. So it's across the board in terms of endurance sports that this is true. There's a reason that those world-class marathoners are running 100+ mile weeks. They have to do that in order to maintain that fitness.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. It's a hard truth, but truth for sure.
Yeah, hard pill. Yeah, I know it's a hard pill to swallow, but yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I think that wraps us up for this week. Looks of it.
Yeah, lots of great questions this month, and continue submitting them for next month if you want via direct message on Instagram or coach@evokeendurance.com. And we'll answer your December questions, maybe some about Christmas and cookie eating. Just kidding. Don't ask us those.
That's a good one. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Kylee, and thanks everyone for the great questions. I hope this was informative, and get out there and keep training.
Yeah, thanks.